What an honor to be here again. I love coming to this place, and I have to tell you, you're my favorite audience. So hold tight. Here we go. The clicker. I'll click it. How does this work? No, I'll click and you change, or does that change it?
That changes it.
I'll say click.
Yes.
All right, thank you. You got to get it right. So, click. So before there was Twain, there was Whitcher. When Mark Twain was making preliminary lists of American humorists that he wanted to include in his Mark Twain libraries of humor, he wrote the name Widow Bedott, i.e. Frances Whitcher, 3 different times in a 3-page list. No other humorists appeared that often, and almost no other women humorists appeared at all. In the end, when 2 other editors joined Twain in putting together the volume, The Widow Bedott did not make the cut. But clearly, Twain was familiar with Whitcher's work, and it made a favorable impression on him. Besides the fact that her Widow Bedott papers was on the Quarry Farm library shelves that Twain had access to, there is every likelihood that the senior Langdon family were familiar with a number of the details I'm going to share with you today about the direct role the town of Elmira played in the satiric sketches ultimately published in the Widow Bedott papers. Further, we know that Twain was not only aware of Whitcher's writing in the 1840s, but actually admired it. In 1906, he recalled that Elmira was the one town where was also born the first distinctly and rollickingly humorous book that was ever written by an American woman. High praise indeed, coming from Mark Twain. Click. Frances Miriam Whitcher first came to live in Elmira in 1847, the wife of William Whitcher, the newly appointed minister of the Trinity Episcopal Church. Until that time, Miriam, as she was called, had lived only in Whitesboro, New York, in an inn run by her large and close-knit family. She was 35 years old at the time. Further, she and William had only been married 4 months when they came to Elmira, so they had much to learn. One decision they made from the beginning they grew to regret, for they had decided they would, quote, not go out in society. I believe they decided this in part because they honestly did not know how to do so, but it made it much harder for them to find their place in a relatively fluid social order. Before they moved to Elmira, Miriam had already published a series of humorous sketches in Neil's Saturday Gazette, all written in the first-person vernacular voice of a husband-hunting, talkative, gossipy widow, the Widow Bedott. Here's a brief sample of her voice as she entertains a would-be suitor, or so she hopes. "Oh, no, Mr. Crane, by no manner o' means. It ain't a minute too soon for you to begin to talk about getting married again. I'm amazed you should be afeard I'd think so. See, how long's Miss Crane been dead? 6 months? Land of goshen. I've known a number of individuals get married in less time than that. There's Phil Bennett's widow I was talking about just now. She was Louise Peirce. Her husband hadn't been dead but 3 months, you know. I don't think it looks well for a woman to be in such a hurry, but for a man it's a different thing. Circumstances alter cases, you know. And then, situated as you be, Mr. Crane, it's a terrible thing for your family to be without a hand to superintend the domestic concerns and tend to your children, to say nothing of yourself, Mr. Crane. You do need a companion, and no mistake." End quote. The whole scene and story ends with Mr. Crane asking the widow Bedott for permission for him to marry her daughter. And the story ends with the widow in a white fury throwing Mr. Crane out of her home. It's important to note at this point that, like so many of the humorists of this period, Whitcher published only under a pseudonym. In her case, Frank was that name, and only her family and a few friends of Whitesboro knew that she was the author of the sketches about the widow Bedott. She continued to publish such sketches after she and William moved to Elmira, and always and only anonymously. Her new friends and neighbors had no idea that she was a writer, and she did not take part in the local literary society. Part of her motivation to continue publishing was financial, for William's salary was just $500 a year, and it was up to him to collect it, as was the custom. Although Miriam was initially paid only $5 a sketch by the Saturday Gazette, the extra income was most welcome, and it did go up as time went on. Setting up their household proved to be a real challenge, for William had no experience doing so previously, and he waffled about finding a place for them to live as early as the month before they moved to Elmira. Ultimately, and at the last minute, he decided to rent a house rather than for them to board, but it was unfurnished, was in very poor repair, and they literally struggled to move in. Further, Miriam had almost no experience doing basic housekeeping, such as cleaning, cooking, washing clothes, even the most basic tasks, so it was a tough beginning for them. But once they found a more suitable house to live in, hired a very competent housekeeper, they settled down and began to become part of the Elmira Society, although Miriam was always a bit remote. William began a sewing society for the Episcopal Church, which Miriam did take part in, and they began to enjoy their new life and new friends. Miriam continued to publish sketches in the Saturday Gazette, mostly focusing on the widow's failed attempts to find a new husband for herself, all written in her vernacular and in the widow's increasingly frustrated voice as she tells of one disappointment after another. Eventually, the widow Bedott resolves to leave the town she was in, called Wiggletown, and to live with her sister, Aunt McGuire, in another town called Scrabble Hill, which, it turns out, had much in common with the Elmira that Whitcher was coming to know. In her first Elmira-based sketch, the widow Bedott resolves to leave Wiggletown. The widow, in fact, travels to Scrabble Hill and is escorted by her nephew, Jeff McGuire, to hear a widower, the Reverend Sniffles, preach at the Baptist church. In spite of her admission that she had a, quote, suffering contempt for the Baptists because they think nobody can't get to heaven without being dipped, and even though she remembers the Reverend Sniffles from an earlier visit as, quote, rather a tall, scrawny man with eyes that looks like a couple of peeled onions, she leaves church declaring she has never been more edified in her life. Elder Sniffles, she declared, is not so bad looking as she remembered, and she even wonders aloud if she had not been wrong to be so prejudiced against other denominations. I should like to be introduced to Elder Sniffles, she says, and hear him converse. And so she does. Before I go into a bit more depth about how Miriam Whitcher would use her character ironically to call attention to social tendencies that Miriam herself found objectionable in her new town, I want to reveal a remarkable set of circumstances that makes it possible to know as much as we do about the relationship between Whitcher's specific experiences in the content of her sketches. To do so, excuse me for a minute while I tell a personal story. 30 years ago, maybe a few more on top of that, after I had written and published a dissertation about 3 women humorists from 19th century America, all 3 who wrote in the first-person vernacular colloquial voices that Whitcher uses. I set out to learn as much more about their 3 lives as I could. All 3 were from upstate New York, while I was from California, but I fortunately received a fellowship to travel to New York for a brief time to conduct more research. In the process, I stopped in at the New York Historical Society in New York City at the advice of a senior colleague who had done research there in the past. I pulled open the card catalogs. You remember them? They were wonderful. I still miss them. On what was to have been my only day in that library, and discovered a brand new entry called The Letters of Frances Whitcher. I called them up and was astonished to find more than 80 personal letters written by Whitcher, primarily to her sister Kate, from the time that she lived in Elmira. They were astonishingly detailed letters about her day-to-day life, her new friends and parishioners, about William's perspective on his new parish. It was a treasury of personal detail that it would take someone like me weeks to assimilate. Click. I talked with the librarian about this remarkable find, and he told me that they had just recently acquired the letters and had hired a young scholar to transcribe them from their original form to a typed transcript. And you can see, that's where we want to be, sorry. The original letters were written on very thin paper and frequently had been written what they call cross. That is to say, Miriam had, in beautiful, clear script, written her letter, then turned the paper sideways and written across it again. And sometimes there were as many as 10 pages written like this. So you can see why they needed someone to transcribe these and put them into typed form. Furthermore, the kind librarian told me that the person who had written the transcriptions was sitting just over there, in case you want to talk to her. So you can be sure I did. We had a delightful, animated conversation in which I came to understand that I was the first scholar who had the chance to look at these letters. Then she said, "If you come back tomorrow, I'll bring you your own copies to take with you." I still can't believe my good luck. I came back, you can be sure, my last day in New York, and she handed me a tall stack of typed versions of Whitcher's personal letters from the mid-19th century. Without these letters, we would know next to nothing about the Whitcher's time in Elmira and the relationship between what Miriam saw and lived there, or shall I say, here, and the many satiric sketches that was inspired by this time. So let's dig in. In November of 1847, the congregation hosted a donation party for the Whitchers. This was a fairly common practice in local churches of the time, and it was intended to supplement the minister's salary with donations of money, food, and other goods that parishioners could share. It was also an opportunity for a significant number of people to get together socially, and in this instance, to welcome the Whitchers socially. Miriam was skeptical about it in advance, but of course agreed to the invitation. The party was to take place in their own home. quote to a sister, "They tell me that all I have to do is sit still and grin and bear it. A committee of ladies is appointed to attend to everything. They go round and ascertain who will provide what, so there's no confusion and no overplus of one thing and lack of another. They come to the house, bring everything necessary for the entertainment." Her next letter to her sister makes it clear that much to her surprise, the party was an unqualified success, thanks in part to the organizational skills of the churchwomen and their generosity. Quote, "They began to pour in about 7 o'clock and continued to come until 9, and I never saw such a crowd. William had taken our bed in the morning and put it upstairs, and we were very glad afterwards, for without using that room, we should have been dreadfully cramped. The house was as full as it could hold, our own congregation and many others. The children were sent into the study, which is a large room. One lady was appointed to receive the money and another for other donations. I was introduced to a multitude of new people. In fact, I did little else all the evening but stand up and receive the company. And I have heard since, to my great satisfaction, that I made myself quite popular. Everyone seemed happy and contented." And then Miriam wrote out a complete list of the donations they received, including, and it's a long list, but it includes the equivalent of 1/5 of William's annual salary, multiple foods, including 8 pounds of beef. I don't know how you do that, but they figured it out. A turkey, tangible objects such as yards of calico and linen handkerchiefs, a blanket, a large lamp, and a beautiful parlor lounge. In March of 1848, 4 months after the donation party, a story with that name in the title appeared in GODEY'S LADY'S BOOK, where Whitcher was now publishing her stories. The timing would suggest that the story was based on their donation party, but in fact, it was written before they had the party and sent off to Godey before, but it got lost. And Godey asked Miriam to resubmit it in December for publication in March. This is a crucial fact because the published story is a scathing criticism of the guest's behavior, unlike anything the Whitchers experienced. Large families came and brought only minimal gifts. Quote, Deacon Peabody and his tribe, there's as much as a dozen on them. They brought a small cheese. I heard afterward that half of it was a donation and t'other half was to go for pew rent. The guests threw raisins at each other. One guest threw a ring of donated sausages around another's neck. A seminary gal threw a hunk of cheese at somebody that broke a lamp, and the oil from the lamp spoiled the one good donation that there was, a new bonnet for the minister's wife, of course. The story finishes with the minister resigning from his position because, as he says, I've been here 2 years, and you've had the kindness to give me 2 donation parties. I've stood it so far, but I can't stand it no longer. Brethren, I feel convinced that one more donation party would completely break me down. What would seem, in retrospect, to be a scathing expose of a failed donation party was, in fact, as I see it, a measure of Miriam's anxiety about how such a party might go wrong and how badly residents could behave, but in no way was it a reflection on their reality. It apparently resonated with her readers, however, and only added to the ongoing demand for more stories from the anonymous Frank and the launching of a new narrative persona, a new voice to guide the satire, one Aunt McGuire. Excuse me. I didn't know where this had gone. Found it, though. Maybe I can even open it. You never know. Well, yeah, hey. It's one of the things that really goes well with age. Have you noticed? Open it. I'll let you, if you'd be so kind. Don't make it look easy. Thank you. Thank you. Unlike her fictive sister, the widow Bedott, Aunt McGuire is a much more compassionate and rational voice. More tuned down, if you will. And she can offer sharp critiques of local characters, but she is also compassionate and measured in her response to events that take place and that she narrates. At times, she serves as an alter ego for Miriam as a minister's wife. At other times, she offers relatively sharp critiques of people's public behavior. For the stories that follow the donation party, Aunt McGuire narrates in the first-person stories that take place in her town, Scrabble Hill. What follows is a series that ultimately put Elmira on the map, but with good company. Apparently, life in Elmira then was not so different from the life in other towns in the region in the mid-19th century. But first, let me step back for just a moment to tell you about Miriam's personal life as it was unfolding in this period. At the age of 36, Miriam Whitcher was expecting the birth of her first child. By this time, in addition to writing regularly to her sister Kate back in Whitesboro, she was in correspondence with Alice Neal, the very young widow who was now publishing Neal's Saturday Gazette. And while they never met each other in person, they formed a close friendship via their personal letters. In March, she wrote to Alice to tell her that she was feeling nervous awaiting the birth of her child. Quote, "Oh, how happy I shall be if I become the living mother of a living and perfect child. I hardly dare to hope it." Unfortunately, her dream was not fulfilled, for her full-term baby daughter died in childbirth. Her husband, William, completed Miriam's letter to Alice on April 1st of 1848. Quote, "The dreaded trial is at last over, and dreadful enough it was, both in duration and severity, and I may add, its results. And you would love her 1,000 times more if you had seen the fortitude, the gentleness, the patience, the sweetness, the calmness, the meekness, and the self-possession with which she bore all her pains and subsequent disappointments and sorrow. Our dear little Mary, for that would have been her name, was born dead." Miriam's recovery took a relatively long time, partially in keeping with the medical practices of the day, and it was 2 months before she met in a public way with members of the parish. But she was not altogether idle in this time. She wrote a new article for GODEY'S LADY'S BOOK, in which Aunt McGuire helps another member of the church named Miss Beersley in the sketch organize a benevolent sewing society for the Scrabble Hill Presbyterian Church. The satiric thrust of the story is much gentler than was the donation party, but with the emphasis being on the foibles of the women of Scrabble Hill, not truly bad behavior. The story explores in a gently humorous way the complex social fabric of women's society of the day, and Miriam was clearly having a good time reporting on it and enjoying the eccentric behavior of fellow church members as they went about her business. The story opens in a celebratory tone. "We're going to have a sewing society in Scrabble Hill. Miss Beersley, Lawyer Beersley's voice, was the first one that proposed it. She hadn't lived here but about a year, and she's always been used to such societies where she comes from, so she felt as if she'd like to have one here. Miss Beersley's just the woman to take a hold of such a thing. She's a wonderful, active little body and a real good woman, too. But above all, she's got a way of saying just what she pleases to everybody without giving any offense. Miss Beardsley persuades Aunt McGuire to go with her from house to house to encourage women to join such a sewing society, though there is as yet no model for how such a society will work in their church and in their town. Their first stop, of course, is at the minister's wife's home. Once she, Miss Tuttle, gives her blessing, the two women move out into the town where they encounter some resistance, but ultimately win the women over to the idea of attending the first sewing society meeting the following week at Miss Beardsley's home. Along the way, we are treated to the eccentricities of the women they visit. For example, Lydia Ann Buell, the old maid Milder in town, she's a curious critter, consents that some folks feels above her, and it makes her wonderful, uncomfortable. She's always on the lookout for slights and insults, and of course she thinks she gets them. And when she argues that Scrabble Hill is too divided to work for a single cause, which a society should do, Miss Beardsley persuades Lydia Ann to join them, to help them to unite it. Charity and the widow Grimms agree to come only when they are assured it will cost them nothing but their time, and 18-year-old Annie Maria Lippincott supports the idea only when Miss Beardsley chastises her for being inappropriately proud that she does not know how to sew. Miss Peabody was entertaining a Miss Fustek and her daughter Jane Elizy at her house, and we learned that, quote, Miss Peabody's entirely governed by Miss Fustek and everything. So she waited to see what Miss Fustek would say before she expressed her opinion about the sewing society, and Miss Fustek didn't want to go into anything without she can be head man. So she wasn't sure how she'd stand in the sewing society, so she hesitated a spell. She was afeared she couldn't consistently do much for the society, she said, because her time was pretty much took up. She was superintendent of the Maternal Society, president of the Daughters of Temperance, and corresponding secretary to the Friends of Humanity. Aunt McGuire and Miss Beardsley visit men as well as women to invite them to participate in a sewing society, but without much luck. One, a shopkeeper, Captain Smalley, presumes to tell them how the society should conduct this business, and he endorses their mission. Unfortunately, as Miss Beardsley predicted, he wouldn't contribute anything, any money, to the cause. So Miss Beardsley wrangles a bolt of sewing material out of him, much to his displeasure. Click. Yeah. The second man they visit is one Professor Stubbles, who's in the kitchen wearing his wife's apron and churning butter, while his daughter is outside chopping wood. He lets loose with a speech to the women about the value of labor, but, quote, he speaks in such a blind, twistical way of talking that a body can't tell what he means half the time. Unfortunately, in creating this character, Miriam stepped on the toes of a community leader in Whitesboro, whom she actually greatly admired, Beriah Green. Admired not only for his outspoken support for labor, but also for helping his wife with the family washing, apparently much to the amusement of the neighbors in Whitesboro. Green, unfortunately, saw himself reflected in the sketch and was understandably offended by it. As Miriam Whitcher wrote in another context, quote, I received at my birth the undesirable gift of a remarkably strong sense of the ridiculous. I can scarcely remember the time when the neighbors were not afraid that I would make fun of them. For indulging in this propensity, I was scolded at home, wept over, and prayed with by certain well-meaning old maids in the neighborhood, but all to no purpose. Whitcher was coming dangerously close to stepping over that line as her sketches went on, but her popularity was growing with the publication of each sketch during this period. Her readers could not wait until the next sketch appeared in GODEY'S. As it happened, the next one, Aunt McGuire continues her account of the Sewing Society. It was a brilliant piece of social satire and her most popular. It was undeniably based on events as they unrolled in the real Elmira Sewing Society, but was also clearly reflective of small-town society throughout the area. Women and their interactions and eccentricities were at the heart of the sketch. It begins like this. Click, please. I wish to gracious you could attend one of our Sewing Society meetings. You never saw nothing to beat 'em, I'll be bound for. Miss Beersley had gotten some shirts cut out of Captain Smalley's cloth, and as fast as they come in, she sot 'em to work. At least she give 'em some work, but there was so much talking to do, there's precious little sewing done. Their tongues went a good deal faster than their fingers did, and the worst on it, they was all a-running at once. There was an everlasting sight a-talking, but it did seem as if they wouldn't never come to no decision in creation. The members are not better prepared to reach any agreement in the next meeting about what they should do with the money they raise. Finally, Aunt McGuire herself proposes that they use it to repair the meeting house. It's in a miserable condition. The plasters are coming off in every so many places, and the pulpit's a forlorn old thing, way up in the air. It's enough to break a body's neck to look at the minister, and it shakes like an old eggshell. Don't you think it would be a good plan to tear it down and build another? Then they all begin to gossip about the widow Pettibone, who claims she had gone off and joined another church because of the poor condition of the church. Ultimately, they put the matter to a vote, and all support it except two, who won't commit to anything, as they say, until Miss Sampson Savage is consulted. At this point, the whole tone of the sketch shifts, for Miss Sampson Savage herself marches in. To quote Aunt McGuire, before I go on, I'd ought to tell you something about her. She's one of the big bugs here. That is, she's got more money than almost anybody else in town. She was a tailoress when she was a gal, and they say she used to make a dreadful sight of mischief among the folks where she sewed. But that was when she lived in Vermont. When Mr. Savage married her, he was one of these here speculators. Whitcher goes on at some length telling how Mr. Savage made his money. He had, quote, no higher end in view than to be the richest man in Scrabble Hill. And, according to the sketch, he succeeded. As for his wife, click, she sought up for a lady. She was always a coarse, boisterous, high-tempered critter, and when her husband growed rich, she growed pompous and overbearing. She made up her mind she'd rule the roast no matter what it cost. She'd be the first in Scrabble Hill. She knows she weren't a lady by nature, nor by education, but she thought maybe other folks would be fools enough to think she was if she made a great parade. So she begun by dressing more and giving bigger parties than anybody else. If there's anybody that won't knuckle to her, I tell you, they have to take it about east. She abuses them to their faces and slanders them to their backs. However harsh these observations, Whitcher is by no means finished with her critique. 2 pages later, with Miss Sampson Savage called out even more for her many faults, Aunt McGuire goes on. Quote, as I said before, she come a marching into the room where we all sat. She's a great, tall, raw-boned woman, and she steps off like a trainer. She had on a dirty pink sunbonnet and an old ragged blue caliker open gown over her dress, and she sat down, hove her own sunbonnet onto the floor, drawed a long breath, and asks, "What they're sewing for? What do you calculate to do with the money you raise?" When told they want to repair the meeting house and build a new pulpit, she makes it clear she does not approve. Click, please. "I'd look pretty, wouldn't I, a-working to fix up that meeting house for Tuttle to preach in?" "Oh, so you don't like Mr. Tuttle, eh?" says Miss Beersley. "Like him," says she. "Not I. He don't know nothing. Can't preach no more that stovepipe." She hates Parson Tuttle because he ain't never paid no more attention to her than he has to the rest of the congregation. "He's as green as grass and as flat as a pancake. He don't know beam from a broomstick nor bran when the bag's open." "I say," says she, "I'd a look beautiful a-comin' to sewing society and working the ends of my fingers off to build a pulpit for Tupple to be poked up in Sabbath after Sabbath and preach just what he's a mind to. No, you don't catch me taking a stitch for such an object. I despise Tuttle, and I'll tell him so to his face when I get a chance. You don't catch me slandering folks behind their backs and then soft-soaping them to their faces, as some folks do. And where's his wife, I'd like to know? Why ain't she here today to work? Pretty business, I must say, for you all to be digging in here to fix up Tuttle's meeting house when she's at home a-playing lady." And then from there, she went on and blazed away about Miss Tuttle at a terrible rate. This slanderous characterization is interrupted only when the hostess enters the room and announces that tea is ready, and the conversation shifts to the food. The following day, Miss Beersley and Aunt McGuire meet to compare notes about their sewing society work, but most of the work has to be done over, and Aunt McGuire ends the sketch by observing, "I feel any most discouraged about the sewing society." Within days of the January issue of GODEY'S reaching the public, that is to say, the one with this sketch in it, in late December of 1848, the Sewing Society was reprinted on the front page of the Elmira Gazette. The story set the town of Elmira on end, and Miriam Whitcher's anonymity was destroyed once and for all. She wrote to her sister, quote, "I cannot give you any idea of the terrible muss which Mrs. Sampson Savage has created here. About a week ago, the town began to be ablaze with it. We don't know who first noticed it, the article, but it spread like fire, and for some days has been the theme of conversation in all places. High and low, rich and poor are all agog about it. There are 2 bookstores here, on each of which the lady's book is taken. At one of them, the demand for the book was such that the bookseller ordered and sold immediately 40 extra copies. And the other one said he could have sold 50 in 2 hours. I suppose there never was so much reading done in Elmira as there had been the past week." People recognized themselves and each other in this story. Depending upon who they were either delighted or furious. Most intriguing of all was the immediate and universal recognition of the town's most prominent woman, Mrs. John Arnott Sr., the unmistakable model for Miss Sampson Savage. Miriam continued in a letter to her sister, "Mrs. Arnott was recognized at once to her infinite rage and that of her friends and toad-eaters. As she is almost universally disliked, of course, there's a deal of crowing and triumphing at seeing her taken off. William's enemies are making a handle on it to injure him, and such worshippers of money that they are dreadfully alarmed. There are some who are bold enough to stand by the minister and tell him to fear nothing but let the galled jade wince. It is not very pleasant for me, who have hitherto been so retired and unnoticed here, to be thus hauled into notoriety and subjected to all sorts of mean insults from Mrs. Arnott and her clique, as I shall be. I fear that William will have trouble. And so he did. But Whitcher was not done with her sewing story. Her next sketch to Godey had Aunt McGuire going to visit in another village. And while she's there, she hears all sorts of gossip about their local sewing society. Quote, "Oh, dear me, there's this awful piece that you ever see come out in the ladies' book, and it's all about our sewing society, taking us off to an iota and telling all that we go on. And of course, 'twas written in this village. And what's worse yet, our minister's wife read it." The woman from the other fictional village goes on, "As true as I'm a live woman, it's got every one of our members in it and shows us all shamefully, only just me and Sarah Ann. We can't see any of us in it. Calls the squire's wife Miss Sampson Savage. Aunt McGuire in the sketch says, I began to prick up my ears. Thinks me, what on earth does all this mean?" What it means, in fact, not in fiction, is that towns all over the region actually believed their sewing society was the model for the sketch, that their own Miss Sampson Savage was exposed in the sketch, and people loved how their friends and neighbors had been put on display. Whitcher revealed that a man from a village in Seneca County came into one of our bookstores the other day to get some ladies' books, saying that they were all alive about it in his place because they had a Miss Sampson Savage there, a village 20 miles from here. They have fitted the coat to a woman there. And still later, an irate husband from another village threatened William with a lawsuit for exposing his wife's character. Everywhere, local people sought a role for themselves and their Miss Sampson Savage, who apparently tyrannized villagers throughout the region. Click, please. What it also means is that Whitcher was observing a nearly universal social phenomenon of the period. I would argue that the controversy struck at the heart of social anxieties of the emerging middle class, the very people who read GODEY'S LADY'S BOOK and who enjoyed seeing the savages exposed for their false claims to genteel social standing. Whitcher hit a chord that would not die down. Subscriptions to the ladies' book jumped to 40,000 copies a month, an unprecedented high. William, meanwhile, somehow managed to smooth things over with his vestry and received a confirmation in person that they would support him as their minister if he remained. All, even those who argued with him, said they would, to a person, support him. And as he explained in a letter to Miriam's sister, a general good feeling thus pervading the meeting, I then told them it was my intention, as soon as I could without loss to myself, to leave them. All went home, apparently, well satisfied. In March of that year, Miriam's father became dangerously ill in Whitesboro, and she and William packed up her personal belongings to send her back to her family, never to return to Elmira. William intended to be gone only 2 weeks, but his effectiveness as a pastor in Elmira was clearly at an end. Miriam's father died shortly after her return to Whitesboro, and Miriam settled into an all-female household once again, while William took on temporary positions as a minister in other towns. Miriam was pregnant again, and this time she gave birth to a healthy daughter named after Alice of Alice Neal's Saturday Gazette. She understandably became a very bright light in her mother's life. Unfortunately, Miriam's health began to deteriorate, and her family suspected correctly that she was slowly dying of tuberculosis. On the 5th anniversary of her marriage to William, January 5th, 1852, Miriam Whitcher died. She was 40 years old. Remarkably, her fame was not over. Far from it. Thanks to the work of her friend Alice Neal, who wrote an introduction to the work, 30 of her stories were published under the title The Widow Bedott Papers in 1855, 3 years after her death. In the 9 years between 1855 and 1864, the book went through 23 editions and sold over 100,000 copies. Then, after a period of relative quiet in the publishing world, it was again reissued in 1883, now 30 years after her death, and continued to sell well into the century. On top of this amazing accomplishment and recognition, an unexpected additional event took place. Click. Yeah, thank you. The humorist David R. Locke, also known as Petroleum V. Nasby, adapted selections from the Widow Bedott Papers for the New York stage. Remarkably, the role of the Widow Bedott was played by a man, Neil Burgess. The play enjoyed several years of success, then Burgess rewrote it as a comic farce, still playing the husband-hunting role as a male cross-dresser. His play, the text of which we can still find and read to this day, focused on 3 courtship attempts, all of which were successful by the end of the play. Burgess's version of the play was a resounding success on the East Coast for nearly a decade, and he also took it as far south as Kentucky and Missouri and as far west as Colorado. Apparently, Burgess was very successful in his role as the widow. As one contemporary figure, George Odell, wrote, "I still see him as the Widow Bedott in the kitchen, making pies, straightening out the affairs of the neighborhood, and personifying, in spite of his sex, the attributes of a managing woman. He was not the least bit effeminate, not at all like the usual female impersonators of minstrelsy or of variety, and yet he was the Widow Bedott to the life and without little suggestion of burlesque. In short, Burgess played it straight and loved doing so, and how I wish I could have seen him." Thank you. Click.